John McCain was obviously one of the first people who's really been out on this. Can you explain how exactly he thinks this cap-and-trade program would work, and has he modified his views from the initial bill that he put forward a number of years ago?
Sure. I mean, it is important, as the sort of introduction went, to connect the dots and to remind ourselves of why this is important. The dispute over climate change science should be put aside, and let's just remind ourselves that the problem is oil, and the face of oil is, Vladimir Putin, who's using it as a weapon. It's Hugo Chavez, who's using the financing of it to undermine democracy in Latin America, and it's Al-Qaeda, who will use it as an economic weapon against the United States. So we need to move away from oil, and that's a motivating factor in John McCain's view of our approach to this. You put in place a cap and trade. What happens then? Well, it's not a carbon tax. It is a cap, a target for emissions or concentrations of carbon and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There are permits which are tradable. They are traded in markets and give financial incentives to sequester carbon where possible, to allow us to use our coal reserves, which are comparable to the Saudis' oil reserves, in a way that's clean, and to give us incentives to develop the technologies to allow us to do that. It will give incentives which will move us directly to the existing technology, nuclear power, that has zero emissions and can be used to power our automobiles, which are our oil problem. If we just move the automobile sector to less of a reliance on oil, as we did with electricity in this country. We may move to the natural gas, but we can move that sector off that. We will solve our international threats on oil. We will solve our climate change problems, and we will have done it by harnessing the power of market incentives, not by having a bunch of directed programs in Washington. You set up the capstone architecture for this and turn America loose and solve the problem. This is the motivating factor. Now, he's got a very specific bill, and he's introduced it twice. If you look at the floor statement when he introduced it the most recent time, he says, look, this is the most pressing issue of our time. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's just not talk about it. If you got a better proposal, put it on the table. Here's mine. But he's not wedded to his. He's wedded to solving the problem. And if there's a better piece of legislation, he'll support it. If there's a better piece of detail in a cap-and-trade program, he'll incorporate it. And we're making advances in the economic science, on the climate science, on the energy science all the time, and these pieces of legislation will evolve as a result. So he's not wedded to the first version of it, the second version of it. He's wedded to doing it and solving this problem.
Why don't we just go left to right, John?
Mayor Giuliani is on record against a carbon tax. As far as the cap and trade, we have not made a decision yet on it. We are looking at it very carefully. It has been tried in Europe, some of you know that, and it has not been tried very successfully. It depends on the final form it takes. We would rather see a market-based solution and obviously some progress in things like nuclear power where you can reduce your emissions. The importance of coal and coal sequestration in the energy picture is very important to the Giuliani campaign. We think there's a lot that can be done in the area of coal, but we got a wait and see attitude on this cap and trade.
Tom?
Brian, I think that besides efficiency, Senator Obama's view is that cap and trade is sort of the other cornerstone of this entire effort nationally. And what I'm encouraged by is what you've already just heard this morning. You've got Republicans either willing to look at it or very supportive of it, and Democrats in much the same position. We find that around in many of the states today. You've got a large number of states that are contemplating a cap-and-trade system either regionally or within the state, including California, the northeast part of our country, Florida, have already passed legislation to enact cap-and-trade. So this is our future. And I think that what Doug talked about, Senator McCain's attitude, that we ought to put them all on the table and look to see what works best is exactly the approach we ought to take. Senator Obama thinks that we can come up with a cap-and-trade system that would be a 100% auction, which deals with some of the problems that the Europeans had. The Europeans gave too many credits away free, and because they they so saturated the market with free credits, it took a while for them to catch up. Things are coming together, and they're now going into the second phase of their cap-and-trade system in Europe, and I've talked to scores of people in Europe who say it's working, and the market concept that underpins this is working quite well. It's exactly the kind of market-driven solution we're going to have to take as part of this. So I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to happen within the next 5 years.
How will we set the cap? We're going to the John Edwards administration will set the cap on greenhouse gases at levels that the latest climate science has determined will be necessary to avoid the worst impact of global warming. So we'll look at the most and the best scientific data and knowledge and people to recommend in that regard. And we will also cap greenhouse pollution starting in 2010, reduce it by 15% by 2020, and as I said earlier, 80%, as Tom has indicated as well, by the year 2050, with the most aggressive plans under consideration in Washington to make that happen. Senator Edwards will auction off portions of the pollution permits to raise $10 billion a year for a new energy economy fund that I talked about a little earlier. It's about a $13 billion fund a year that will be used to help with clean coal technology, to help the automobile industry make the transition that it needs to make, to help invest in other alternative energy sources.